Out, there have been 55 women that we know of who have come forward so far. And Kate, I know that you have spoken to nearly 24 of those women. What are you hearing from them today?
Well, Craig, if we can, I actually want to go to one of those women who I've been texting with while I'm sitting here, and I think she's joined us on the phone now. Patricia Stoyer is one of the accusers of Bill Cosby, and you may remember that way back in 2004, when Andrea Constand made her allegations in the first place, that's the woman involved in this criminal case in Pennsylvania, you may recall that at the time there were Jane Does listed in the court documents, other women who were willing to testify on Andrea Constand's behalf way back in 2004. Now, they were never called to testify because, of course, it became a civil suit. There were never criminal charges back then, and they settled out of court without ever having to call on those other women. One of the women who was a Jane Doe back then is Patricia Stoyer. And, Patricia, are you with us on the phone now?
I am, Kate.
Patricia, it's great to connect with you again. You and I have been texting about this day since yesterday, and I know you said you were reluctant to get your hopes up. How are you feeling right now?
Very excited for Andrea, primarily because all she's ever wanted was for this to happen, and it's been a long time coming for her.
And you have said to me that you're willing to be involved if they want you involved at this point. Remind me, have you spoken to the prosecutors in Pennsylvania at all?
I spoke to an attorney who was not an attorney, an investigator. I think he was part of the police department months ago when they were looking into the original charges. I called and spoke to him, and he told me there were two parts to the investigation. One was to investigate the original claim, which had to do with Ms. Constand and Mr. Cosby. And then the other part, if they decided to go forward, was to interview people who were also survivors.
And so Ari Melber is sitting right next to me. He was explaining that we're really not at that point yet, Ari, right, where we would have other women needing to testify. But it could come to that as the trial moves forward. It
certainly could. And Ms. Stoyer, it's interesting hearing some of your background and your contact with this office. For our viewers who are wondering, legally in a typical case, if someone is accused of an individual crime, evidence of other crimes does not typically come in. And the exception to that, which we expect the prosecution to potentially pursue here, is an exception when particular crimes are so similar and potentially unique that they could form evidence that's relevant to the crime at hand. We would expect, it's called the prior bad acts doctrine, we would expect the prosecution in this case to potentially pursue that avenue with regard to the drugging and the doping. I wonder, Ms. Stoyer, if that is something that you did experience and did discuss as a pattern with the investigator in this prosecutor's office that you say you had past contact with.
In this particular instance, he did not ask me about specifics of my story, but yes, that is something that I experienced at the hands of Mr. Cosby. And if they decide there is a pattern of behavior that could be established, and if the judge allows it, then I expect that it's possible that I and some of the other women will testify.
Patricia, I just want to pick up on one other thing because I know your story pretty well, and it was just being talked about Andrea Constand's relationship with Bill Cosby and how that relationship actually continued after the allegations that she made. He still was in contact with her family. I know from speaking to you and speaking to so many other women that that's a pattern that many of you describe, that you had relationships with him. In fact, in your case, Patricia, you spent some time with him, you said something happened, and then you ended up going back again, correct?
That is correct, and it's because people have often faulted those of us who did that. I can only speak about my own experience, but I did not understand what had happened to me the first night that he assaulted me. He drugged me. I woke up. I was very confused, very disoriented, and very, very sick, and I had to ask him what had happened. And he said that I'd thrown up and passed out, which made no sense to me after consuming less than one cocktail. So I really didn't understand what had happened, and I made myself entirely responsible for it.
And it was only later, Patricia, that you thought, oh, this was something else.
That's right, because when he assaulted me again in Atlantic City a year and a half later, I connected the dots. I thought, I remember feeling like this once before, only in the second instance, I knew that I had been physically assaulted.
Patricia, thank you so much for being on the phone. Craig, I want to send it back to you, but I do want to note in fairness that last fall when Patricia said those things, we did reach out to the Cosby camp, and at the time they denied all of her allegations.